panel tonight. Let's meet them. We got conservative strategist, human events contributor, and Right Turn Strategies president, the one and only Chris Barron. And for the first time on this luscious showroom, we've got director of the Libertarian Institute and author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. What better person to have on than Scott Horton? And he's the host of The Richard Fowler Show, which happens to be hosted by a man named Richard Fowler. He's going to join me in a moment. We're having a few technical difficulties with Ricardo because he's so handsome and alluring. We can't get to him just quite yet, but we're going to patch those things up, and we're going to have a mini-man panel for now. So let's talk a little bit about this. There are Democrats all over Congress who are very upset about this, Chris Barron. This seems to be one of the few things that we can agree on, like pandas are cute, Brittany needs to be freed, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was botched. So who should be held accountable?
A lot of people should be held accountable. And look, by the way, like the buck stops with Joe Biden. And as much as he's told us that like the buck stops with him, he's never actually admitted that anything was done wrong. That's what's like so incredulous about this. It's like they actually think we didn't see what happened on TV, that we never saw any of the reporting. I mean, they are literally trying to gaslight us in real time. We've got video of Biden saying in July that the Taliban wasn't going to take over. And he was completely outraged and annoyed that somebody would even ask him that question. And today he's sitting there telling George Stephanopoulos, we always thought this was going to happen. There's nothing we could do better. Look, here's the thing that is most discouraging for me. We had consensus in this country that it was time to leave Afghanistan. Now, thanks to Joe Biden's single-handed debacle in exiting this country, we now have a majority of people who aren't sure whether or not we should leave Afghanistan. Congratulations, Joe. You have crushed one of the only reasonable consensuses that has been built in this country in a very long time. That is that we ought to bring our troops home. And thanks to your ham-handedness, you now have people questioning that. Good job, Joe.
So, Scott, as I look at this, you know, obviously a lot of libertarians are going, well, this is why you don't get into these things in the first place. This is what happens, because when getting out is as bad as getting in or staying there, it should be a lesson to future presidents not to get into these things. Do you think those lessons will be internalized?
Well, certainly the American people are going to internalize them after this. And I agree with what he said about you know, the bungling here making withdrawal look bad, but we should not lose sight of the fact that this entire war has been bad. What Biden really did wrong here was he should have stuck with the May 1st deadline, like in the deal, and then we would have had the so-called decent interval to get out before the whole country fell to their power. And instead, they kicked the can down the road just long enough to make it look this bad. However, you know, I think people are also projecting their kind of worst fears about what would happen onto what has happened. So, for example, there has not been some kind of Black Hawk Down slaughter and disaster where our embassy officials are mortared and machine gunned on the way to the airport or anything. They're all safely out, and the flights are continuing, and the Taliban have respected the ceasefire with our side, at least during this. And people act like this is the worst-case scenario, but the worst-case scenario would be 3 more bitter years of fighting, and then the Taliban win anyway.
I don't disagree with you about that at all. I agree with you completely, and that's why you've had 4 successive administrations that have been trying to figure out how the hell to get out of there, including going as far back as 2003. But I do think it could get much worse because you have 15,000 Americans who are still inside, and you've got Jake Sullivan going, yeah, well, if you're not in Kabul, we really can't get to you. And they can't. And then we're seeing images from all over Afghanistan, you know, of the best case scenario is graffiti of women's faces on murals being painted over. But then you have guys getting kicked in the head and women and children being shot. And God knows what else is happening where there isn't internet and, you know, there isn't cell phone reporting. But I do think, unfortunately, it could get very, very bad. And, you know, it also leaves the door open for hawks to go back inside and say, you know what, maybe we need 20,000 troops. Maybe we need another surge. What were you going to say, Chris?
I was going to say, this is actually the worst case scenario. Like Biden wants you to believe that like this other thing that no one was talking about is the worst case scenario. This is the worst case scenario exit that could possibly be imagined. And you're absolutely right. The downside to this, like I mentioned before, we have eroding public support for withdrawing troops, which is the right thing to do. And it's going to empower the handful of hawks that want to continue to have this endless war. They're going to use this botched withdrawal as an excuse to put more American lives at stake. So, yes, this is the worst case scenario. They could not have been executed more poorly. The president lied in July. He's lying today, and it's time for somebody to take responsibility.
Yeah, and
sure,
okay, go ahead. Last word, Scott. You have about 10 seconds.
Oh, sure. Well, just remember, all the generals were the ones who told everyone, including the president, that they had built up a 300,000-man army that was sure to stand for at least months, maybe years, which was just a complete fantasy. It just wasn't true.
No, it wasn't true. And it just goes to the ultimate point, which was there was not an understanding of how the country functioned and how people interfaced with what we call a country. They don't have the same view of it. So we could throw all the money in the world. It's not going to change their culture or how they defend it. And we don't have an understanding of that. And no one bothered to try and figure that out. And now we're here in a very messy breakup. Chris Barron, Scott Horton, and Richard Fowler is here. Hi, friends. Richard, it's so nice to have you on the show. So I will start with you because you didn't get to talk last time because we were having technical difficulties. I was not censoring you. But tell me, why is he having a hard time? And this, by the way, the 538 aggregate number was before Afghanistan.
Yeah, listen, I think that, don't get me wrong, I think that the president made a huge misstep and a huge blunder. What we saw this past weekend, right, as folks saw the harrowing images of folks holding on to American airplanes as they were trying to leave Afghanistan. At that particular point in time, that's where the president's approval rating began to tank, because he didn't prepare the American people for what they were witnessing, understanding that, you know, whether or not we left yesterday, today, tomorrow, in 10 years, the scene might have looked potentially the same. And so I think what the White House has got to have, what they've got to really do now is they've got to begin to have real conversations with the American people about what the future of Afghanistan looks like. Will we be able to get our foreigner Americans who are living there out? Will we be able to get those who helped our troops, those who worked in journalistic organizations, women who fought for women's rights in that country are now trying to leave? No matter if they're in Kabul, if they're in Kandahar or other parts of Afghanistan, this White House has to make this commitment, and they've got to get this done in order for him to turn these numbers around.
But if you listen to some of his advisors, Scott, they're like, the president is doing great. He has trillions of dollars in stimulus spending. The unemployment numbers are going in the right direction. Things are more expensive. Isn't that great?
Right. And listen, I think Afghanistan is not really the issue when it comes to the public approval rating. It's the price inflation, especially in housing, and which is, of course, driven by monetary inflation. And so we have all the chaos from the lockdowns last year. And then we have, you know, in my hometown of Austin, Texas, the price of a house has gone up by $100,000 or more across the board. And so there are homeless people everywhere. You can't drive your truck without hitting somebody. It's completely out of control and all over the country. And that's just one thing. Of course, food and all of the basic staples, everything, gasoline, everything people need to survive. The prices are going crazy. At the same time, we're still kind of in a recession from the lockdowns.
Yes.
And as far as Afghanistan, people should really get this straight. Leaving Afghanistan is the greatest accomplishment of Donald Trump and Joe Biden's life. And Donald Trump negotiated this exit deal, and Biden stuck with it despite all the political pressure. And of course it's ugly on the way out, but they ought to really be celebrated for finally doing the right thing. After 20 years, your previous guest, Mike Baker, agreed, we shouldn't have even gone to Kabul. We should have killed bin Laden and not even done a regime change in Kabul. Well, if that's right, well, then we definitely shouldn't have gone to Iraq and to Tripoli and to Damascus and now in Sana'a in Yemen and the entire terror war for 20 years. It didn't have to be this way at all. And Biden is, to a great degree, responsible for it, especially Iraq War II. But for them to finally bring this thing to an end should be celebrated, even though I agree, obviously, it is pretty ugly the way they've done it. And they had fair warning. My book came out 4 years ago and predicted that exactly this would happen.
Yes, And you were a part of a very large chorus of people saying, here are the facts, not going to end well. And I think that's why there was so much hesitation from every administration to finally do it, for fear that it would end like this and it would tar their legacy. I hate the idea of governing by legacy. All right. Now, meanwhile, former President Trump still banned from Twitter, but the Taliban is free to tweet all they want. The social media company has come under criticism recently for banning many conservative voices, even the former president, who is even suing some of the big tech firms for censoring him. So why the double standard? Twitter says the terror group can keep using the platform to promote their propaganda as long as they follow the rules, which outlaw the glorification of violence, platform manipulation, and spam. Other social media companies like Facebook and YouTube have banned the Taliban from using their sites. So what will it take for Twitter to suspend its own hypocrisy? Chris Barron.
I mean, nothing. Nothing. They're never going to stop being. The hypocrisy is never going to stop from Twitter. And by the way, it's not just the Taliban. Like, the Taliban's got free reign to tweet. The genocidal Communist Party in China has free reign to tweet. You know, the gay killing regime in Iran has free reign to tweet. But Orange Man bad, he can't tweet no matter what. I guess maybe if a couple of Taliban people rushed the Taliban parliament one day and like caused a commotion, then they could call that an insurrection and they could kick the Taliban off of Twitter. Short of that, I'm not exactly sure. They don't care about hypocrisy. Yeah. They're not even trying.
Scott, I may hold the minority opinion here, but I think it's actually better to have more people on Twitter because you can see what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely right. Free speech isn't just the First Amendment. It's a cherished American principle. And I think as far as Twitter, Facebook, any of these organizations, anything but direct threats of violence between people should be protected. And Donald Trump should be on there. It's not just Donald Trump. There are a lot of really good people and some bad people who've been kicked off of Twitter and all of that. But, you know, Thomas Jefferson said that air of opinion is tolerable as long as reason is left free to combat it. So what do truth tellers have to be afraid of?
Nothing. Jack Dorsey in his salt-covered beard. Richard, should we just ban everyone who's mildly offensive and possibly murderous?
Hey, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander here. So I do think the Taliban should probably be banned from Twitter like
slop. They are. I don't care about the gander.
But with that being... But with that being said, right, I do think that we have to have a larger conversation. When we say free speech, you have to remember that much of these are private corporations. So until Washington decides
he qualified and said free speech is not just about the First Amendment. That's a very, very important point.
I hear that, and it's on Washington to and Congress to figure out how to do it. And to Scott's earlier point, where we were having this conversation around, you know, applauding both Trump and Biden for getting us out of Afghanistan. I think it's also worth applauding Barbara Lee, the congressman from Oakland, California, who was the only vote against a blank check to war in 2001, which we know what happened in Afghanistan was multiple.
She was not the only vote.
We're going to get bin Laden.
Have you forgotten Dr.
There was
Ron
one vote
Paul?
against AU on that.
Yeah. No, she was the only one.
All right. I was just throwing Ron Paul in there because I really like him. I always want Ron Paul to be on the right side of everything. He loves gold. Okay. Thank you, man panel. Scott, it was great to have you on the show. Did you have a good time?
An excellent time. Thank you so much for having me, Kennedy.
Good. Please come back, and hopefully at some point you can do my podcast as well. Kennedy Saves the World. You guys